"Why did you come in a taxi today?" Those 6 words landed in the middle of a sentence from Elena like a dropped marble in a glass bowl. The meeting room filled with the usual corporate white noise, the faint hum of the HVAC, someone's laptop fan, the steady tick of a wall clock. And for a beat, everything else went quiet. I could feel the fabric of my jacket against my collarbone, the coffee stain on my mug doing nothing to disguise how small my hand seemed in that room. Owen sat 2 seats down from me, palms loose on the table as if he'd always been allowed to rest them wherever he wanted. He gave that casual half-smile he used when he wanted to make a point seem like nothing at all. And then, with the kind of nonchalance that had been a weapon for him for years, he said, "Charlotte's using Abigail's Audi. She needed it to get to Phoenix for a family thing." A soft intake of breath, a shuffle of papers. Elena's eyebrow rose the tiniest fraction. "The company assigned Audi?" she asked. "Yes," Owen answered, as if he were describing the weather. "I lent it to my sister. She is borrowing it for a few weeks." It was such a small, ordinary exchange on paper. A chair, a car, a voice. But in that precise slice of time, it felt like the center of my life had been nudged off its axis, and I was watching the tilt happen in slow motion. People in the room shifted their weight. Paul glanced at me with an expression that read, "Are you okay?" Richard Chin's face hardened the way it always did when legal matters smelled faintly in the air. Elena looked at me as if she were trying to decide whether to reach across the table and steady me or to call security. My mouth went dry. The coffee tasted metallic. I wanted to laugh at how absurd the whole thing was, or at how finely tuned my own embarrassment had become. I wanted to say, "Wait, that's not possible." I wanted to name every time I'd reached for my teas this month and found the slot empty, the moments I'd walked to the garage and felt a sharp, small grief at the absence. Instead, I heard my voice, quiet and deliberate. That's not what happened. There are moments when you realize you can either protect someone you love or protect the version of yourself you need to stay alive. For years, I habitually covered for Owen. I took calls at 3 a.m. when his niece needed a ride. I let my calendar be adjusted so he could step into committees he said aligned better with his role in HR. I told myself I was being supportive. I told myself marriage was about small concessions. But this was different in a way that had nothing to do with generosity and everything to do with entitlement. Elena sat forward. "Explain." The rest of the world contracted until what existed was the conference table, the ring of faces, and the small electric thrum behind my ribs.
I told them, simply, the truth that had been piling up like unread emails in my psyche. The car had been gone for almost 3 weeks. Owen had told me it was with Charlotte. I had come in by taxi for a client presentation this morning because the car wasn't available, and when I'd asked him about it last night, his laugh was thin, and his reply was, "It's fine, Abby, family first." Elena didn't blink. There was an economy to her response, fast, firm, that suggested she knew how to move a domino before it could take down the whole tray. "We'll need a written statement," she said, "and I'm going to call legal." The room blurred for a second while her voice arranged itself into action. Someone in my mind tried to file down what came next into categories: gratitude for a boss who did not look away, dread for what a legal review could mean, the hollow sense of betrayal. Owen's face shifted then, a twitch of irritation that I'd chosen the corporate truth over his private convenience. If you're wondering why a car would become a battleground for someone's life, I want you to picture the layers underneath a thing like that Audi. It was assigned to me with my promotion to Senior Solutions Architect, a marker, yes, of status, but also a practical tool. I lived a 40-minute commute from the office. My work involved late nights that could end in a whispered email exchange or an emergency meeting set up across time zones. The car meant autonomy. It meant I could get places on my own schedule, protect my time, and carry myself into rooms where decisions were made with my head held up instead of bunched in the corner of a taxi seat. When Owen told the room that his sister was using it, he wasn't merely describing logistics. He was unmooring a symbol of my professional identity and making it a family favor. It was, in the most insidious way, the punctuation of a years-long sentence where I found myself shrinking to accommodate someone else's voice. If you want to hear how that single question, "Why did you come in a taxi today?" moved from a sharp moment in a conference room to a full-throated investigation that upended my marriage, my career, and the life I'd been building, stick around. I'll tell you what happened next. 3 weeks earlier, the morning had been ordinary in every possible way. Our kitchen had the small, lived-in smells I associate with comfort, the warm citrus of detergent, the lingering hug of yesterday's dinner reheated, the dense sweetness of dark roast coffee. I remember the steam rising between my fingers as I held a chipped mug and scrolled through code reviews on my phone. I remember the small, exact rhythm our lives had settled into. Me at the sink going over the API integration plan, Owen at the table tapping through his morning HR briefs, his laptop open to a spreadsheet I'd learned not to comment on unless invited. "Can I borrow the Audi?" he asked. He didn't preface it with a story.
He used the language of assumption, as if borrowing something you both owned was a neutral fact. I looked up from my phone. The light through the kitchen window caught a fleck in his jawline. "For Charlotte?" I asked, because my impulse was to be practical before being suspicious. He nodded. "She needs to get to Phoenix for a family thing," he said. "It'll be fine. I'll handle the paperwork." The words landed warm, like steam. I wanted to believe them. After all, Owen lived in HR. Part of our marriage had been built on the same axis his job required: trust in process, trust in documents, trust in a world that could be put right with the right form and the right approval. He made it sound, and I had believed it for years, like he was the person who would keep things in order. I told myself then, for comfort, that it was just family. We both come from families that mobilize quickly for birthdays and funerals and last-minute needs. I said yes, because saying no seemed small and punitive and painted me as the unreasonable partner. He kissed my forehead and left with a set of keys that, in the coming weeks, would become an instrument of erasure. Small erosions happen quietly. They are not dramatic at first. They whisper. You misplace your calendar because someone else schedules meetings for you, and you begin to think you are forgetful. You discover small charges on a shared card, and he laughs it off as 2-for-1 grocery trips. The explanation sounds plausible. You take a seat in a meeting, and someone you trusted has already changed the slide deck and removed the lines that gave you credit. Each tilt alone is survivable. Accumulate them into months and then into years, and they form a pattern. Your autonomy shaved by a millimeter each time. It started with minor conveniences turned presumptions. He began to volunteer me for committees without asking, sending my name to event organizers for speaking slots, and then failing to loop me into the prep calls. I would show up to an event, only to find he'd already promised I'd handle the technical demo, while he stood by and framed it as my initiative. He would then, in the quiet of our car ride home or over the toaster at breakfast, minimize my fluster with a comment like, "You're always so humble about your wins, Abby. Let me manage the politics." The pattern sounded supportive until it wasn't. It felt like a partnership only when the nation of his needs required a border to be redrawn on my map of autonomy. The credit card issue appeared as almost a joke at first. A notification pinged on my phone one evening, a charge I didn't recognize, a recurring software subscription and a vendor's name I hadn't authorized. Owen swore it was a mistake, said he would handle a refund, and then said with that odd mix of charm and command I'd mistaken for decisiveness, "I'll call them. Don't worry about it."
Then another notification, a small airline bill, then a hotel booking, both in my name on a corporate card I had never authorized for those trips. The bank's fraud team flagged the pattern. When I asked him, he shrugged and explained that sometimes HR had to issue corporate cards for business travel and the bookkeeping got messy. I accepted his explanation because it was easier than the alternative. The cognitive dissonance of believing someone I loved would weaponize my finances for his convenience. At work, the subtle undermining had a voice and a signature. My quarterly review reflected comments I didn't remember making, phrases that suggested I lacked initiative. A performance note reading, in paraphrase, "team contribution inconsistent," found its way into my file months after I had been told privately by Paul that I was doing exemplary work on the integration. When I asked him about the discrepancy, he hesitated. "I can talk to HR," he said. But talking to HR assumed HR was a neutral arbiter. At that point, it wasn't. At that point, HR had become a centralized place of power, and the guy who ran that place sat at our family table and said, with a shrug, "I'm doing what's best for the company." There were other small things that, seen in isolation, seemed inconsequential. My fingerprints were used to approve an RSVP to an event I'd never attended. My name appeared on minutes for meetings I didn't remember chairing. A volunteer schedule had me listed on a Saturday cleanup when I had prepared to drive to a client site. Each incident came with a casual explanation from Owen, delivered with a look that told me the alternative was me being petty for noticing. I began to measure my days and absences, the time the car wasn't in the garage, the mornings I walked to the bus stop instead of opening the door and feeling the leather of the Audi's headrest against my back. I took taxis. I learned to compress the dignity of arrival into the lurch of a fare meter. At work, colleagues whispered about my tiredness. Clients remarked on my stamina as if I were a marathoner expected to keep going no matter the conditions. Inside, something hardened. The first morning, I deliberately left a note for Owen, not accusatory, just factual. His reply was a string of small apologies and a promise to make it right. But making it right for him meant rewriting the narrative so that whatever he'd done came wrapped in benevolence. I learned to parse his language. We all need to support family, translated to, your needs are negotiable. I've taken care of it meant I've decided without asking you. Before long, the Audi was gone for days at a time, then a week, then nearly 3. I started scheduling my life around its absence, adjusting client calls and canceling social plans without exclamation or complaint. At night, when the apartment blurred into a flat wash of blue from notifications and the hum of the refrigerator, I would replay the mornings where I had given my keys with an easy breath and try to trace when ease became abdication. There are other people in this story whose faces turned the pattern into a map. Rachel, my friend since grad school, was the first person I told when I'd noticed the car missing for the first week. She listened on the phone while I read off the timeline, the receipts, the odd texts that had started to appear on my phone. "Abby," she said, in that clear, unflinching way she always had, "that doesn't sound right." She offered a spare bedroom when things got loud at home, and later would be the person who handed me a box of sweaters while I packed to leave. Paul, who had been a supervisor and sometimes ally, started looking over his shoulder in meetings, as if the presence of HR made him uneasy. A few times he paused mid-sentence, then changed direction, as if he'd been reminded there were consequences to naming things loudly. There were moments when I tried to address it directly. I asked Owen, gently, then with more clarity, about unauthorized charges and logistics for the car. He would respond with a practiced, calm tone that made you feel petty for asking. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill. I did what I had to do." He often framed it as my overreaction, a gaslighting tactic that made me recalibrate my own sense of what was normal. The slow, corrosive effect of that tactic is hard to overstate. I began, occasionally and with shame, to apologize for bringing it up at all. On the Tuesday before the meeting, an email arrived in my inbox. Subject line, Town Hall, Leadership Logistics. It was odd because I had been listed as a presenter. I had prepared slides for the client-facing portion of the event. In the body of the email, there was a note, in Owen's hand, effectively if he had access to templates, that said Abigail would be presenting and that her car would be available for client transport. I clicked the thread and found replies that confirmed reservations. Then, baffled, I checked the company calendar, and there was no block for my prep session. My name was in the lineup, but the calendar event lacked the preparatory meeting we'd scheduled. That small bureaucratic omission was the kind of thing that made a big visible difference. I arrived the morning of the town hall earlier than usual in a taxi, thinking I could smooth everything with a quick coffee and a run-through of the slides. I remember stepping out of the car into a cool dawn and the papers crinkling in my laptop bag. The receptionist, who had been my friends for years, gave me a sympathetic look that I now know was trying to send me a warning. When I called Owen to ask where the car was, he laughed. "Oh, Abby," he said, "Charlotte needs it. I told you. You'll be fine. It's just a taxi." His laugh, the one that had always been a balm, now sounded thin, as though it had been used too often as a salve for inconvenient facts. It was the sound that would, in retrospect, be part of the evidence of a pattern, dismissal, wrapped in a tone so familiar I nearly answered with, "Okay." Instead, I held my tongue and went to the meeting. I sat in the back and watched clients arrive, smiling the way I'd been trained to smile through awkwardness. I presented. I answered questions. I felt like a machine performing an operation I no longer fully owned. Then came the morning 2 weeks later when I stood at the office entrance and realized the Audi was not in its reserved spot. It had become an absence I could measure by the number of keys I fumbled through without finding the one I wanted to hold. I caught myself in the reflection of the elevator doors and did the math in my head of how long I'd been accommodating the pattern. When Elena asked that question in the meeting room, "Why did you come in a taxi today?" the timeline sharpened from a smear into a sequence with cause and effect. The car was not merely missing. It had been appropriated as a matter of family convenience by the very man who controlled the policies meant to protect employees from exactly this kind of conflict. It was an extraction of privilege that looked like love. People often ask why I didn't confront it sooner. There's a postage stamp reason and a wallpaper reason. The postage stamp reason is the immediate smallness of the moments. He borrowed the car to help his sister. He promised to handle the paperwork. He said it would be back tomorrow. you can justify forgiveness in the immediate. The wallpaper reason is the pattern that built across years, trust encrusted into partnership, into the daily acts that make two lives mesh. When someone you love is also someone who can tweak records and adjust narratives, you learn to stay inside the soft, compromising shapes of peace, because the alternative is to admit that your partner is weaponizing your trust. Back in the conference room, Elena's question was more than curiosity. It was a probe with teeth. She knew, instinctively, that a company card disappearing into a family use orbit suggested potential abuse of a role, and when HR's director is married to the employee who reports the issue, the conflict stops being small and becomes structural. Her hands moved intentionally. She asked me to go through the dates. She asked me to provide evidence. When I mentioned the text messages, the late-night dismissals, the casual "don't worry about it," she asked to see them. I handed over my phone. Reading my own words back to the table felt disorienting. One minute, you're keeping a log of irregularities like a responsible adult. The next, those logs transform into testimonies that will be parsed and archived and used in ways you can't yet imagine.
The easy privacy of domestic conversations turned into the brittle clarity of documentation. Owen's face changed when Elena called Richard Chin and asked if legal could look into a conflict of interest situation. You could see for a moment the human flicker of someone realizing a convenient narrative was about to face daylight. He tried to smooth it with a dry joke about a family emergency. Elena didn't laugh. By the time the call ended, security had been asked to retrieve the car. There's something strangely intimate about watching your own property returned by strangers who treat the process like a neutral administrative duty. The Audi came back with the passenger seat still warm from another body, with a faint smudge of sunscreen on the center armrest. It smelled faintly of lemon and the tang of someone else's perfume. That detail lodged in me like a splinter. Someone else had sat in my car, had put a bag on my back seat, had used my space. The car was not merely transportation. It was the container of small boundaries I had once assumed were immune to negotiation. When the security guard placed the keys on the table between us, Owen's mouth curled. Not a smile, but the kind of expression you get when you realize a joke isn't landing. Elena said quietly, "We need to document who authorized the vehicle's use. Please provide written authorization from anyone who borrowed it." He hesitated, then wrote something on a sticky note, a name, a shorthand, and slid it across as if handwriting were a remedy. Elena took his note and slid it into a folder. Paper became evidence. Paper began to make the situation official, no longer breathable as private friction. Walking home that evening, taxi fare punched into my expenses as another line item, I tasted something that was not exactly victory and not exactly grief. It was recognition. The act of having named the wrongness out loud moved it from the realm of private shame to public scrutiny. The recognition felt like the first crack in a glass that had been fogged over for too long. Once you break a surface, light pours in differently. There's an odd mix of relief and dread that comes when you decide to stop protecting a narrative that is killing you. Relief because you are no longer alone with the knowledge of what's happening. Dread because naming it starts a chain reaction. Documents must be gathered. People must be interviewed. The company must weigh its policies against the actions of someone with the authority to bend them. And in that chain reaction, your private life is cataloged. Your motives become a thing to be scrutinized. Your marriage becomes subject to an internal audit. That night at Rachel's tiny kitchen table, I laid out the text messages, the calendar anomalies, the receipts for charges on my corporate card I didn't make. She arranged them into piles like a detective working on a case she had no business investigating. "You did the right thing," she said when she'd finished, the sentence steady as a beam. "You can't unmake what he did, but you can make sure it's documented." And so the documentation began. We copied texts into PDFs. We screenshotted calendar entries. I wrote a narrative, dates, times, facts, that Elena requested to present to legal. I summoned the kind of clinical language you only use when you are preparing evidence: unauthorized use, conflict of interest, pattern of misrepresentation. Each phrase changed the shape of my life. It moved me from someone who accepted explanations to someone who was capable of naming abuse. There were private humiliations that followed, word, delayed and imperfect spreads. Owen's family called, not to ask if I was okay, but to suggest that I was making a fuss. Social messages slid into my accounts, sympathetic on the surface, accusatory in suggestion.
Someone I hadn't spoken to in years messaged a question that was less curious than insinuative. Is it true you and Owen are having trouble? It's strange how, in these situations, the person who reports a pattern of manipulation is often painted as the troublemaker. The moral logic reverses. You become the disturber of the peace. By the time Elena made the decision to engage outside counsel and instruct security to retrieve the vehicle, the stakes had changed. A company investigation meant that what had been private was now being treated as institutional. Emails began to arrive from addresses with the suffixes you only see in formal communications. outsideCounsel@something.com. I tried to breathe through the bureaucratic language. We will need all pertinent documents for review, one message said. Please prepare any relevant correspondence and receipts. The words felt like an invitation and a threat at once. I packed a small bag that night, not because I thought I'd leave home immediately, I did not, but because packing felt like reclaiming agency. I slid sweaters into a canvas tote, tucked in a few chargers, put a printout of the API specification in a folder and placed it on top like a talisman. If there's a practical skill I've honed as an engineer, it's the ability to convert chaos into a plan. Making a bag was, in its way, converting a personal crisis into a manageable project. When someone asks me now whether the decision to tell the truth in that room was easy, I think of the 1,000 small moments that prefaced it, the stolen keys, the altered reviews, the charges that didn't add up. Truth was not a sudden eruption. It was the endpoint of a fatigue so profound I could no longer be complicit. Speaking in the conference room was not a performance. It was an act of reclamation. At home that night, Owen and I sat across from each other like two colleagues set against a neutral table. He asked quietly if I'd given the statement. His eyes had an odd, frantic sheen, a softness that read like anger in the form of plea.
Why did you do it in front of everyone? He asked, voice pitched low, as if the public nature of the moment had been the real transgression. Because it was company property, I replied. Because it's a conflict of interest. Because you're HR. He leaned forward. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, he said. You don't appreciate what I do for this family. I heard then, for the first time in that long exchange, the particular way he framed pressure, not as an admission of constraints, but as an entitlement to bend rules. The pathetic little violin of pressure had become, in his mouth, a justification for making unilateral decisions about my assets and my professional life. When the legal team stepped in, outside counsel, as Elena had promised, meetings multiplied. There were forms to sign, an intake interview where I recounted dates and details, and the curious clinical detachment of lawyers whose job is to convert human hurt into evidence. A young woman from legal who introduced herself as an investigator, with a binder full of questions and a steady, competent tone, asked me about the authorization history for the vehicle. She took notes with an electric pencil and never once made it about me personally. To those who prefer narrative arcs, this felt like a relief. Finally, there was someone whose job was to listen and process without favoritism. Owen, for his part, agreed to cooperate, at least publicly. He gave a statement that consonanced with his habit of reframing accountability into benevolence. He apologized for any confusion. He insisted his sister had needed help. He said he'd assumed he had authority to allocate the car for family needs. In himself, he crafted a script that, to outsiders, could read like a casual, misapplied generosity. People respond to these moments differently. Some employers immediately take steps to separate the parties, at least administratively. Elena did. She placed Owen on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. It was an action not taken for the spectacle of it, but because rules exist precisely to prevent the contamination of personal privilege into corporate resources. To be placed on leave is to be frozen in a liminal state between normal operations and potential culpability. For him, it was a humiliation camouflaged as due process. For me, it felt like a kind of ventilation in a house that had been slowly suffocating me. The day the Audi came back into my possession was not triumphant in the way I'd imagined. It had the same dings it always had. The seat smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. But inside me there was a different aroma, a smell like ozone after a long storm, metallic and clean. It was the scent of a boundary reestablished, if only administratively. More importantly, it was a sign that someone higher up understood that the lines had been crossed and that they would be examined. There is no clean line between being supportive and being complicit. That morning in the conference room, Elena's question broke the silence that had allowed my small erosions to accumulate. It turned the private into the public in a way that would, in months to come, force us all to reckon with the difference between the two. When I walked out of that meeting room and into the corridor, the fluorescent lights hummed in a way that sounded like static between two stations. I held the folder with my statement pressed to my chest like a shield. I thought about all the hours I'd spent debugging code in a company that, in principle, valued integrity. I thought about how fragile the scaffolding of trust became when the person managing it wielded the power unevenly. Outside, the late afternoon sun had softened the building's facade into something less corporate and more domestic. I paused by Elena's office, and she said quietly, "You did the right thing." I believed her in that moment, but I also knew that belief was the beginning of a long, complicated work. Saying the right thing in public starts processes you can't control. It starts formal reviews. It starts testimony. It starts the slow, exacting work of converting your lived experience into documents, into deposition, into exhibits. It starts an arc that will take you from being a spouse protecting a partner to being a person seeking accountability. When the security guard placed the Audi keys on my palm, warmth transferring in a small, literal way, I felt the orbit of my life shift. The car was a tangible return of something taken, but it was also a symbolic delineation. I had stopped shrinking. The key was small, but it was a tool. I slid it into my bag as if to carry now a small instrument of agency. Walking home that night, the city lights blurred into streaks. I remembered a line from a paper I'd written years earlier about systems resilience. Small failures, if unchecked, produce systemic collapse. I thought of that line not as an abstraction, but as a map of my marriage and my career. The system that allowed a man to assign company property to family without oversight was a system with a failing censor. My claiming of that failure was not revenge, it was a recalibration. There was, in the days that followed, an odd kind of sharpening. Conversations with coworkers moved from the surface to the substantive. Paul, who had previously been circumspect, began to ask me gently if I wanted support in meetings. He did not offer platitudes, he offered concrete things. Introductions, a cover email for some of my deliverables, a note to a client explaining a scheduling hiccup. It was the kind of practical solidarity that reinforces the scaffolding of a career. At home, the air felt different. Owen oscillated between contrition and indignation. He made small, rehearsed apologies that felt intended to soothe his own reputation more than ours. We spoke about legal procedures in the same way people discuss weather patterns that are theoretically manageable. He told me he was consulting with an attorney. I heard, underneath the words, the hum of self-preservation. And yet, despite the administrative texture roaming around us, a private ache persisted. Naming the abuse did not dissipate the grief of discovery. It did not erase the quiet afternoons of my own life, where I had allowed small concessions to accumulate until they had polished away edges I needed. It did, slowly, begin to reassemble me into someone who could insist on boundaries without apologizing for them. The conference room question was the hinge. It was a single sentence that moved me from a mode of accommodation to a mode of defense. It made me understand that sometimes the act that alters a life is not a grand gesture, but a refusal to keep a micro-injustice small. Elena's action, immediate, precise, practical, set in motion things I could not control. But she did, by asking that question, create the space for me to begin to tell a story that was bigger than our kitchen table. She let my private evidence become public, and in that crossing, I located a path forward. The days after the keys felt like someone had switched the lighting in my life, not from dark to bright, but from one kind of dim to another where edges became visible. The legal emails multiplied in my inbox, subject lines that started polite and grew more formal, requests for documents, a secure link to upload statements. Outside counsel introduced herself as Mara Ellis, and she had the steady cadence of someone who knew how to turn a messy human story into an orderly stack of evidence. Her messages were efficient. Please upload receipts, screenshots, calendar exports. Please provide any additional witnesses who observed unauthorized vehicle use. Each itemized request translated grief into a checklist. I spent an afternoon at Rachel's kitchen table, the same table where we'd sorted my texts and calendar entries, and now we added bank statements and corporate card reconciliations. The paper rustled between us like leaves. Rachel made me coffee and set it down in front of me with the same steadiness she'd always offered when my life felt unmoored. "This is how you win," she said quietly, pointing at the piles. "Documentation wins." Vanessa's name came up early. I'd known her peripherally, former HR, left the company a year earlier under sour circumstances I'd heard only as office whispers. Mara asked if I could reach out. Calling Vanessa felt strange, as if I were tapping someone for a secret handshake into a private hall of records. She agreed to meet in a cafe near the office. When she arrived, she looked like someone who had taken care of herself. Short hair, a scarf against the chill, a brace of files tucked under her arm. She slid into the booth like a person about to tell a truth she had carried.
I saw the pattern, she said, not beating around it. Not everyone notices HR until it nudges them.
But I noticed discrepancies, interviews listed that never happened, templates of performance feedback that were filled in after the fact, and a lot of entries that aligned with one person's agenda. Her voice was low but crisp. She didn't need to dramatize. She handed over a folder with printed emails she had kept when she left, calendar entries showing approvals for travel in Abigail's name, a chain of authorization emails signed off from an internal alias that wasn't standard, and the memo where someone, and Mr. Callahan, had instructed administrators to accommodate family logistics in a way that read less like policy and more like directive. We paraphrased sections into notes for Mara. There's a pattern of retroactive approvals, Vanessa said, and there's a culture of deference to HR that made it easy for someone there to push favors through. I kept copies because I was uneasy. Maybe I should have said something louder, but I did bring it to risk management before I left. Her willingness to corroborate was not instantaneous. There was a weight in her decision. That weight mattered in the months to come. Mara's team did the work of legality with patience. A demand letter arrived on firm letterhead before the attorney representing Owen did. The tone was measured. Return company property and reimburse any unapproved charges. Cooperate with the investigation. I read it on the train, the city vibrating around me, the words feeling both shield and cudgel. The opposing counsel's reply was predictable. Questions of scope, requests for clarification, an early suggestion that this was a domestic matter in an attempt to narrow its corporate implications. I learned quickly how common that strategy is. Reposition the breach as something private so that institutional responsibility shrinks. The company's internal investigation proceeded in parallel to the legal posturing. Outside counsel interviewed a ring of people. Paul gave a detailed account of work assignments that had been reassigned, pointing to specific meeting minutes that contradicted notes that suddenly appeared in my file. Vanessa provided her documents and a narrative that held up under scrutiny. Richard Chin's office coordinated with outside counsel, producing an interim report that used clinical language, pattern of unauthorized authorization, falsified documentation, conflict of interest, and included redacted exhibit attachments that clearly showed calendar entries, corporate card charges reimbursed without receipts, and an internal form marked as authorized in handwriting that did not match standard signatory protocols. One of the exhibits was a paraphrased readout of a chain of text messages between Owen and a company fleet manager. The texts, in essence, asked for a vehicle to be assigned to family assistance without going through the proper approval channels. Another exhibit was a spreadsheet of charges on my corporate card, hotel stays, car rentals, and a string of meal charges that matched dates the car was out of my possession. The report didn't editorialize, it just collected items and arranged them like evidence laid out on a table. There were days I felt like a person in an experiment, being observed through a two-way mirror. Colleagues were careful. Some offered support in a hush, a message in the company chat, an offer to cover a client call. Others maintained distance, unsure where the power balance would settle. Owen's family called with an odd mix of sorrow and reproach. At work, rumors took on the textures of old plaster, cracks filled in with theory and then smoothed before falling again. Social media picked up the faint edges of the story and tried to make caricatures, but the centralized narrative that mattered was the one being built by paper and deposition. I began visiting Mara's office for strategy sessions. She introduced me to Catherine Vance, the family law attorney she recommended for separation issues. Catherine was practical in a way that steadied me. We spoke about options, about the intersection of corporate processes and domestic law, and she cautioned gently that legal processes are both slow and blunt instruments. They could restore some things, but not all. We'll aim for clarity and protection, she said. You can expect contested exchanges over finances and possibly attempts to discredit you. Prepare your evidence and conserve your energy. She did not instruct me to do anything that would compromise the corporate process. She helped me separate the spheres so I could hold each in the right posture. Toward the end of the investigative phase, Owen was placed on administrative leave. The company's decision landed like a sudden winter. The world outside looked the same but walked differently. For him, it was humiliation. For me, it was a measure of institutional willingness to treat concerns seriously. The interim report from outside counsel concluded there was enough evidence to warrant further action. Signatures that could not be authenticated, backdated entries, and a pattern of personal favors dressed as administrative acts.
That language, pattern, warrant further action, would be quoted in court filings. Discovery began in earnest. Lawyers from both sides exchanged documents and interrogatories. There is an odd intimacy to discovery. You send across your life in redacted packets, and someone else reads the seams. I provided bank statements, screenshots of messages, calendar exports, corporate card charge records, and the folder Vanessa had given me. Owen's team produced their materials as well, but the weight of the company's internal audit, its neutral language and corroborated exhibits, shifted the tone of subsequent requests. Deposition day was a long, fluorescent-lit exam in the kind of conference room where I had spent years running design reviews.
The lawyers sat like chess players, cool and patient. I answered questions that felt straightforward at first, dates, times, items, and then moved into the territory of motive and context. The opposing counsel tried to frame my reporting as emotional and reactive. "Isn't it true," he asked, "that you had previously forgiven Mr. Callahan for similar conduct?" It was a question designed to portray me as lenient and inconsistent. I said simply that forgiveness in private was different from institutional authority abused in public, and that the cumulative impact of unauthorized actions affected my professional role. My voice shook at points. Catherine later told me that vulnerability in a deposition, when paired with clear evidence, can be a strength. People relate to humanity. Vanessa's deposition was concise and powerful. She explained why she had kept records, how she had noticed the recurring inconsistencies, and why, in her professional judgment, they mattered. Paul testified about real assignments that were shifted and the confusion that set in as tasks and recognition were moved around. The company investigator who compiled the audit, a careful woman named Lila, walked through the methodology of the report, explaining how they triangulated calendar data, fleet logs, and email headers to build a timeline. The court reporter's machine clicked like a metronome through it all. When it came time for trial, the air tightened. The courtroom smelled like varnish and paper. The judge was a man with silver hair and a tendency to speak in a tone that flattened drama into procedure. Opening statements framed the dispute differently. My counsel positioned it as a case of systemic misuse of authority, resulting in economic and professional harm. Owen's counsel presented a narrative of miscommunication and domestic complication. Both opening statements were persuasive in different ways. Both appealed to different instincts. Evidence was introduced: the internal audit, the financial reconciliations, calendar prints, and several paraphrased excerpts of messages. One exhibit was a reconstructed timeline with attached exhibits at each point: the dates the car was logged out, the charges that appeared on the corporate card, the dates entries were added to personnel files. The evidence was not just about a car. It showed a pattern: appropriation of company resources for family use, retroactive documentation, and a campaign of subtle professional attrition, marked by altered performance descriptors. There were also harder emotional moments. I remember Martina, a senior manager I'd mentored, taking the stand and speaking about how my quiet advice had helped her present to a difficult client. Her testimony was not about the case's facts, but about the kind of professional presence I brought into a room, the very thing that had been undermined.
Paul's testimony about the discrepancies in team assignments and his unease at raising them to HR was important because it showed the institutional axes of what had happened. When HR itself becomes an instrument of favoritism, accountability blurs. Cross-examination was an exercise in pressure. Owen's attorney tried to suggest that I had motives beyond the obvious: ambition, a desire for promotion, and that my reporting was strategic. I expected that. I had rehearsed how to answer. I focused on facts. My goal, I said during one exchange, was to protect company assets and ensure processes were followed. My career is not separate from my integrity. That statement was not a grand moral claim. It was a precise boundary. In the months after, several colleagues later told me it had been the most credible line they had heard because it sounded to them like normal human concern framed in professional terms. When the judge issued the written findings, the language was formal but heavy. He found that there had been unauthorized use of company property and a pattern of document manipulation that could be linked to decisions made or influenced by the person in the HR director role. The ruling ordered reimbursement for unapproved charges, corrective action on personnel records, and a monetary award for reputational and career impacts. It also required the company to implement tighter controls around vehicle allocation and signatory verification. The final paragraphs were careful to note that this ruling was case-specific and that outcomes differ depending on circumstances, a judicial nod to the complexity of such disputes. Reading the decision in a small conference room with my attorney present, I felt a range of things: validation, relief, and something like exhaustion thinning into stillness. The ruling did not erase the erosion of months and years. It did not instantly return lost weekends or the subtle career momentum that had been diverted, but it did provide a formal acknowledgement of harm and a mandate for change. The divorce was its own layered procedural arc. Catherine guided me through settlement talks that navigated property, finances, and the division of assets. We negotiated with the pragmatism of people who had been shaped by systems, spreadsheets, valuations, lines of custody. There was grief in those meetings, but it was not theatrical. We signed the papers in a room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and law book glue. The division of the house and assets was equitable on paper. The deeper personal division was raw. I remember packing the last of my books while Owen watched through the doorway, his posture a complicated mix of relief and wounded pride. He left that day, and the apartment felt like a stage that had hosted a long rehearsal finally ended. Moving into my own place felt like an act of reclamation and a small domestic victory.
I painted a wall a deep, steady blue that I'd always liked but had never convinced him to agree to. My boxes smelled of cardboard and the faint citrus of packing tape. I arranged my desk by the window and placed a small potted plant on the sill. For the first month, I woke at odd hours with adrenaline and then a wash of fatigue. Slowly, the adrenaline ebbed and routine reasserted itself. At work, rebuilding meant returning to what I knew how to do: ship features, mentor junior architects, and show up where work mattered. I finished the delayed API integration, the one I'd been carrying like a talisman in my folder when I packed the bag the night I left home, and delivered it on a sprint cadence that felt both familiar and nourishing. The project's success was not merely technical, it was public. Clients sent notes complimenting the team's responsiveness. Paul and I reestablished a working rhythm, less shadowed now by the specter of HR's prior interference. I began to take calls with people I had never met from other companies, invited to speak about resilience in technical teams. The months of rebuilding piled like small, deliberate bricks. Promotion conversations surfaced later that year. Leadership acknowledged the fallout of the incident and the work I had done to keep client projects on track despite the disruptions. The promotion to VP of Solutions Architecture landed not as a trophy, but as recognition of sustained contribution and the capacity to lead teams through complex cross-functional work. When Elena called to tell me, she sounded almost embarrassed by the formality of it all, and then very sincere. "You've shown a steadiness that matters here," she said. "We need that voice." Her words were small and essential, a calibration of professional belonging. I was careful in those months to use the platform in ways that mattered to me. I started a mentorship program for women in engineering at our company, making sure junior staff had a safe channel to discuss conflicts of interest and the kinds of boundary erosion I'd experienced. I hosted sessions on how to document concerns, how to navigate corporate processes, and how to keep professional identity intact in the face of personal entanglement. Those meetings were raw and practical. People shared stories that echoed mine: a mistaken approval, a shaky review, a favor packaged as generosity. We did not preach. We built tools: templates for documentation, a checklist for reporting conflicts, and a network of peer support. There were public moments, too. I accepted an invitation to speak at a regional tech summit about resilience in systems design and the human parallels of failing sensors. I spoke about small erosions and the importance of institutional guardrails, and afterward people came up to me with their own stories. Some were small, some were wrenching. The applause was not the point. The point was the quiet of people stepping forward to say, "Me too."
Romance, over that year, arrived softly and without fanfare. James came into my life the way good things do when you're not looking for them, through a mutual friend at a work dinner. He listened, really listened, and he did not absorb my story like someone waiting to file it away as anecdote. He met me where I was, acknowledging the past without spectacle and offering the future without quid pro quo. Our relationship moved at a pace that felt considered, dinners that were actually conversations, weekends without performance, small acts of practical kindness like changing our own light bulbs without a dramatized explanation. He celebrated professional wins and offered space on days when the bureaucracy of HR reforms needed to be fed. When he met my friends and colleagues, he did it with the easy confidence of someone who was not trying to occupy all the air in the room. There were no cinematic reconciliations with Owen. Our divorce closed with the quiet paperwork of lives unbundled. He moved out of the apartment in a week of boxes that left our old space feeling strangely anonymous. Time, not trauma, did the bulk of the work. I stopped shrinking because I stopped allowing the micro-compromises to define my day. I started saying no with a tone that wasn't apologetic. Boundaries became muscle memory. A small ritual emerged. Some mornings I'd walk to the office and see the Audi in its reserved spot near the loading dock. It glinted in the sunlight like any company car, functional and unromantic. Sometimes I'd pause and imagine the months prior when it had been a locus of violation. Now it was just a vehicle, assigned, tracked, and governed by policy. The symbolism was still there, but it had been recontextualized. The car hadn't been the enemy. It had been the marker, and markers change meaning when systems change. Institutionally, Scottsdale Tech implemented tighter controls. Fleet assignments required multi-party authorization. Digital logs were time-stamped and auditable, and HR policies were updated to require an independent reviewer when family members of HR staff requested exceptions. These changes weren't a trophy on my shelf. They were infrastructure. They mattered because they prevented the same small erosions from happening elsewhere. When I spoke with the compliance team months later, they credited the audit and our push for clearer processes as catalyst for those reforms. That felt right. Not revenge, but improvement. Professionally, I leaned into mentorship and systems leadership. My team grew, and I learned to hire with a lens for psychological safety. We built review processes that left visible trails, notes, timestamps, and open channels for dissent. I watched junior architects I'd mentored present confidently to clients we'd struggled with in the past. Watching them, I felt that quiet warmth that comes when your effort ripples outward. There were quieter victories, too.
I reclaimed small things that had been normalized away. The right to refuse a last-minute weekend meeting, the right to reclaim my evenings, the right to take a vacation and not respond to email. These were not grand statements. They were practical acts that rebuilt dignity. Friends continued to be the scaffolding. Rachel's cat would wind around my ankles when I visited, a small and amoral comfort. Vanessa and I had coffee occasionally, matching our schedules to talk about how organizations can make safer spaces. Paul and I had a regular check-in, where we would talk about projects and the occasional absurdity of corporate life. Elena and I developed a professional friendship that was honest and unadorned. She sometimes called me simply to run an idea by me regarding cross-functional leadership. There were moments, though, when the memory of those early erosions rose like a ghost. A late-night notification, a credit card reconciliation, or a nod from a former colleague could trigger a flash of the old constriction. Those flashes taught me patience with myself. Healing, I realized, is often a series of small, unremarkable acts rather than a single sweeping recovery. It is the accumulation of things like sleeping through a plane flight without checking messages, taking a weekend trip without guilt, and saying no to a project that didn't align with my values. A year after the conference room question, I stood on a stage at an internal town hall and spoke candidly about what had happened. I did not indict people in the room. I described the lessons we'd learned about process, about reporting, and about the importance of unambiguous controls when personal relationships intersect with institutional authority. I told the story as one person's account, not a manifesto. After my talk, a line of people came forward, some to thank me, some to ask for advice, some to offer solidarity. One young engineer hugged me and whispered, "I didn't have a voice. You showed me a way." It was a small moment that felt, in its quiet, very large. The Audi remained a practical part of the narrative. On a rainy afternoon, James and I drove to a client demo, the car's windshield wipers keeping time like a metronome. He grinned in the passenger seat and said, "It's funny, this car has been through more than anyone should." He didn't mean it as levity. He meant it as observation. Even mundane objects can accumulate histories. I reached across and squeezed his hand. It felt in that motion like a stitch of normalcy. If you ask me now what altered my life, I would tell you that it wasn't the boss's question alone or the return of a key. It was the decision the question forced, to stop covering over small injustices in the name of peace, to translate private discomfort into public documentation, and to allow a system to examine itself. That chain, question, disclosure, investigation, adjudication, rebuilding, is messy and slow.
It involves legal appointments, paperwork, sleepless nights, and slow recovery. It also involves people who stepped forward, a boss who asked the right question, a former HR colleague who kept records, friends who offered a couch and a steady presence, legal counsel who organized the chaos into enforceable claims, and mentors who offered opportunities to rebuild. There is a cautionary humility to tell. Not everyone will have the same resources or outcomes. This was my case, specific in its players, its facts, and its institutional structures. My victory was not a universal guarantee. It was the particular constellation of evidence, policy, and witnesses that came together in my favor. That truth matters because empathy has to be matched with realism. If you find yourself in a similar pattern, documentation and counsel can help, but every situation differs. What I kept with me from the whole experience wasn't a ledger of grievances or a desire for retribution. It was a new muscle for boundaries and an awareness of how institutions need guardrails. I became more intentional about where I invested my energy, who I trusted with decisions that affected my work, and how to translate private harm into collective accountability. My work shifted from coding solutions to designing systems that could scale human decency. On the day I moved my plants into my office and hung a small print that read, "Systems that Sustain," I felt a kind of quiet pride. It wasn't triumphant in the loud way some narratives are packaged. Instead, it was the steady satisfaction of a long, patient repair. The Audi sat in its spot outside my building, no longer a marker of injury, but just an office asset doing its job. When I slid into the driver's seat that afternoon for a client meeting, the leather was familiar, the engine a soft purr. I adjusted the seat, set my phone to Do Not Disturb, and thought briefly of the conference room question that had been the hinge. If you've stayed with me through this story, you know how those 6 words, "Why did you come in a taxi today?" pivoted a life. They were not a miracle or a single blow. They were a probe that opened a door. What followed was grit, paper, testimony, and slow rebuilding. It involved people whose ethics mattered more than their titles. It involved the patient sorting of records and the willingness to stand in a room and tell the truth. If my experience speaks to anything, it's this. Small erosions add up. Institutions need controls. Individuals deserve the right to protect their professional agency. And sometimes, the courage to name a single small wrong can begin a long arc towards restoring what was taken. If this story connected with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts or similar experiences in the comments, not as a call for legal strategy, but as a space for solidarity. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe. Thank you for listening.